Hello. So I'm going to read you The Boy Who Loved Math. And the subtitle, which means the smaller title underneath the big one, says The Improbable Life of Paul Erdos. So that means it's a book about a man. It's a true story. There once was a boy who loved math. He grew up to be one of the greatest mathematicians who ever lived. And it all started with a big problem. Paul Erdos lived in Budapest, Hungary with his mama. Mama loved Paul to infinity. Paul loved Mama to infinity too. When he was 3, Mama had to go back to work as a math teacher. She didn't want anything bad to happen to Paul, so she left him with the one person she knew would take very good care of him. She left him with Fraulein. Fraulein had too many rules. That was the problem. Paul hated the rules. He hated to be told when to sit still, when to eat, when to go to sleep. But what could Paul do? He couldn't exactly solve the problem, but Paul knew that when summer came, Mama would be home with him all day, 100% of the time. So he taught himself to count really high. Then he figured out how many days it would be until summer vacation. It made him feel much better to know the number. So Paul kept counting and thinking about numbers. One day, when he was 4, Paul asked a visitor when her birthday was. She told him. "What year were you born?" she asked him. She told him. "What time?" She told him. Paul thought for a moment, and then he told her how many seconds she had been alive. 1,09,152,358 seconds. Paul liked that trick. He did it often. Paul played with numbers. He added them together and subtracted them. One day, he subtracted a bigger number from a smaller number. The answer was less than 0. How could a number be less than 0? Mama told him numbers below 0 are called negative numbers. Paul thought that was so cool. Now he knew for sure he wanted to be a mathematician when he grew up. But first, he had to tackle another problem. School. Mama sent him to school, of course, but when it was time. But Paul and school were not a good match. Paul could not sit still for long, so he got up and ran around the classroom, but that was against the rules. Oh, how Paul hated the rules. How could he solve this problem? Paul told Mama he didn't want to school anymore, not for one more day, not for 0 days. He wished he could take days away, negative school days. He pleaded with Mama to stay home. Luckily, Mama was a worrier. She worried about germs a lot. She worried Paul could catch dangerous germs from the children at school. So she helped him solve his problem. She said he could stay home with Fraulein. But even Fraulein was better than school, maybe 500 times better. Fraulein and Mama did everything for Paul. They cut his meat and buttered his bread and got him dressed and tied his shoes. That was great. It meant Paul could think about numbers all day. Numbers were his best friends. He could always depend on numbers to be there and behave in the same way. Numbers followed rules. He didn't like rules in life, but he liked rules in numbers. And so Paul turned 7, then 8, then 9, and when Paul was 10, he fell in love. He fell in love with prime numbers. Prime numbers are special. They can't be divided evenly. A prime number can only be divided by itself in 1. The first prime number is 2, but that's the only even prime number. And the other prime numbers are odd. The numbers 3, 5, and 7 are prime. But not all odd numbers are prime. 9 isn't prime because you can multiply 3 times 3 and get 9. Paul had a lot of questions about prime numbers. Do they go on forever? Is there a pattern to them? Why is it that the higher you go, the farther apart the numbers are? Paul loved to think about prime numbers. When he got older, Paul went to high school. He liked school a million times better now. He had made many friends, people his age who loved math and were good at it too. Paul and his friends did math together all over Budapest. But Paul was the best. He loved being at the top in math, and at the top of towers and mountains and bridges too. He thought about math, whatever he was doing, wherever he was. By the time Paul was 20, he was already famous around the world for math. People called him the magician from Budapest. But he still did not know how to do his laundry, or cook his food, or butter his bread. And that was not a problem. He still lived at home, and Mama did everything for him. Oops, sorry, I forgot to show you the picture. But then one day, when Paul was 21, some mathematicians invited him to go to England to work on his math. Could he survive in the world on his own? He rode the train by himself. He met the mathematicians, and they all went to dinner. Everyone else talked and ate, but Paul stared at his bread. He didn't know how to butter his bread. Finally, he took the knife and put some butter on it and spread it on his bread. Phew, he did it. It wasn't so hard, he said. Even though he could now butter his bread, Paul soon realized he didn't fit into the world in a regular way. He wasn't the kind of person to cook or clean or drive a car or have a wife and children. He wasn't the kind of person to live in one place and have one job. He was the kind of person to do math all of the time. And he still didn't like to follow the rules, so he invented his own way to live. Look, I'm going to show you. Here's him trying to butter his bread. I think it's pretty funny. Here's what he did. Paul would get on an airplane with 2 small suitcases filled with everything he owned, a few clothes and some math notebooks. He might have $20 in his pocket or less. He flew from New York to Indiana and to Los Angeles. He flew across the world from Toronto to Australia. I have no home, he said. The world is my home. And whenever he went, wherever he went, when he got there, the same thing would happen. A mathematician would meet him and take him home. The mathematician and Paul worked on math. Paul played with the mathematician's epsilons. That's what Paul called children, because an epsilon is a very small amount of math. So they're saying that he played with the mathematician's children to help them learn math when he was in these other countries. And just as Mama had done, friends all over the world took care of Paul. They did his laundry and cooked his food and cut open his grapefruit and paid his bills. Now, Paul wasn't the easiest house guest. He made messes, big messes, like the time he got impatient and opened tomato juice by stabbing it with a knife. And he often woke up his host at 4 o'clock in the morning and said, "My brain is open." That meant he was ready to do math at 4 in the morning. He wanted to do math about 19 hours a day, every single day. And on the bottom, there's a thing that says 19 hours a day times 7 days a week is 133 hours a week of math that he wants to do. One time, when he was a young man, he broke a rule that got him into big trouble. He climbed over a fence to look at a radio tower, and he got arrested. The police thought he was a spy. The FBI thought he was a spy, so they spied on him for years after that. Why did his friends all over the world put up with him and take care of him, call him Uncle Paul and love him? Because Paul Erdos was a genius, and he shared his brain. He helped people with their math problems and gave them more problems to do. Plus, he was a math matchmaker. He introduced mathematicians all over the world to one another so they could work together on math. Paul knew that a mathematician plus a mathematician equals a mathematician and much more and better math. So this is the equations on his brain. Mathematician plus mathematician equals more and better math. Paul and his friends did so much great math. They worked in math called number theory, combinatorics, the probabilistic method, and set theory. I don't even know what that means. Paul showed his friends how to do math in new and better ways. He even started some new kinds of math. Some of the math that Paul and his friends worked on gave us better computers and better search engines on the computer. So a search engine is like Google. Also better codes for spies to use. So this is all of his friends working. Uncle Paul was generous with his brain and his money too. Whatever money he had, he gave away. He gave money to poor people. He offered prizes for unsolved math problems. Even when Paul got very old, he still did math. He did math while he played chess. He did math while he drank coffee, lots and lots of coffee. He thought about math when he played ping pong with his best friends. Paul said he never wanted to stop doing math, and he didn't. To stop doing math, Paul said, was to die. So Paul left this world while he was at a math meeting. So they're saying that he passed away while he was at a meeting for math. And that's kind of interesting because he said to stop doing math would be like dying. So when he was very, very old, he happened to pass away while he was at a meeting doing math. All over the world, mathematicians still talk about him and love Uncle Paul. Even people who never met him, they talk about their Erdos number. If you did math with Paul, then you get an Erdos number of 1. If you worked with someone who worked with Paul, your Erdos number is 2. People are so proud of their Erdos numbers. So this means people who knew him, if you worked with him, you were one person, think of like separation. So here's me, and if you worked with me, it'd be Hallenbeck 1. And if you knew someone who worked with me, it'd be Hallenbeck 2. So it's people who worked with him and knew him all have a number of how they worked with him. So this is kind of a map of that. A long time ago, there was a boy who loved math. Numbers were his best friend. He grew up to be the man who loved math. Numbers and people were his best friend. Paul Erdos had no problem with that. And that's the end. So in the back, there's a little note about the author. So it says, when I was a child, I loved math as much as I loved reading and writing. But as I got older, I started to think math was for other people, but not me. So how did I come to write a book about an important mathematician? All the credit goes to my sons. My older son, Aaron, loved math from an early age, and he asked us to give him math problems for fun. One day, he told us about this math pilgrim named Paul Erdos. Oh, and it tells you how to pronounce it, so I've been pronouncing it wrong, Paul Erdős. I was intrigued when our younger son, Benjamin, who was not what I would call a math guy, started talking about Paul. I knew I had more to learn, and I loved Paul and his story. He was an unusual person who didn't fit into the world in the regular way. Yet he figured out how to have a wonderful and meaningful life with an amazing career and lots of adoring friends. I was touched by his generosity. He was a genius in a field of geniuses. That's our image, isn't it, of a mathematician, that they all work alone and that they're geniuses. Paul did not believe in hiding his genius. He shared it from person to person, country to country. One of his friends described him as a bee moving from flower to flower, but with math. And because he did share, new fields of math were founded and mathematical research discoveries and applications multiplied exponentially. So that long, fancy sentence means that he shared his math with people and math grew as a result. So all these different ways of math were created because of him. Paul demonstrated that math could be fun. And if you weren't already depicted as a saint on a church wall, I would say that he should be. So he's saying he's so important that there should be pictures of him everywhere, basically. So that's Paul Erdős, as we have learned how to pronounce. And now you're going to answer the questions in Seesaw. I want you to answer what the story is about. If you don't remember his last name, you can just write Paul, okay? So I want you to tell me what the story was about, who was the main character. So who's the main character, who's the boy? And then 3 things that happened, maybe when he was a boy, Why didn't he like school? And when he was older, what did he do? Okay? So if you can only think of 2, that's okay. Try to think of 3 things, all right?